The world inside the KV-1 ended at the steel hull. Outside, it was June in Lithuania, blue skies, birch trees, the smell of summer dust. Inside, it was a factory floor compressed into a coffin. The air temperature was already pushing 40 degrees Celsius. It tasted of unburnt diesel and the sour copper tang of 5 men sweating in close quarters. "Driver, halt," the lieutenant said. His voice didn't boom. It was flat, tinny, squeezed through the throat laryngophone pressed against his neck. The tank lurched. 45 tons of Voroshilov steel dipped forward, groaning as the suspension springs compressed, then settled back with a metallic thud that vibrated through the soles of their boots. The silence that followed the engine cutting out was heavier than the noise. "Why are we stopping, Comrade Lieutenant?" The driver, a boy whose hands were stained permanently black with grease, looked back. His eyes were white circles in a soot-covered face. "Crossroads," the lieutenant said. He pressed his eyes to the periscope. The rubber eye cup was slick with sweat. Through the thick glass, the world was distorted, a green-tinted slice of reality. But he saw them. They were coming up the road from Raseiniai. Not soldiers. A snake. A mechanical snake of Opel Blitz trucks, half-tracks, and motorcycle sidecars kicking up a plume of dust that reached the clouds. The German 6th Panzer Division, or at least their supply line. They were driving casually, elbows out of windows, cigarettes burning. They thought the Red Army had evaporated. The lieutenant pulled back from the sight. He looked at his loader, a large man hunched over the 76mm breech block. "Load he," the lieutenant whispered. The loader didn't ask questions. He reached into the rack, the muscles in his forearm jumping like cords as he pulled out a high explosive shell. The brass casing scraped against the metal floor. Shh! Clack! The breech slammed shut, a sound like a bank vault locking. "Target ahead, trucks, 600 meters. The turret traverse mechanism whined, a sick, grinding sound. The KV-1 was a beast, but it was a slow beast. The lieutenant watched the crosshairs drift over the lead truck. Fire. The tank didn't just fire, it kicked. The recoil sledgehammered the air inside the turret. Dust shook loose from the ceiling seams. The empty brass casing was ejected with a hollow clatter, rolling on the floor, steaming hot. Through the periscope, the lieutenant saw the lead truck disintegrate. It didn't explode like in the movies. It simply ceased to be a truck and became a cloud of splintered wood and ragdoll shapes. The German column stopped. For a second, there was no reaction. Just shock. Then, the anthill was kicked. Figures in field gray scrambled into the ditches. "Load canister, machine gun, sweep the ditch." The coaxial DT machine gun stuttered to life, filling the cabin with the sharp, acrid smell of burnt gunpowder. It was a smell that coated the tongue. Then came the return fire. It started with small arms. Bullets pattered against the armor like rain. Tink, 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 meaningless. The crew ignored it. They were gods in a steel chariot. Then, a sharper sound. A crack whip noise outside. "Anti-tank guns!" the radio operator yelled, pressing his headphones tight. "They're bringing up the PaK-36s." The Germans called the 3.7cm PaK-36 the door knocker. The lieutenant was about to find out why. He saw the flash from the tree line, a white puff of smoke. Whang! The impact was not an explosion. It was the sound of a sledgehammer striking a church bell, magnified 10 times. The sound didn't come from outside. It was born inside the metal, traveling through the steel and into their bones. The lieutenant's vision blurred for a second. His teeth rattled in his gums. "Damage report," he shouted, his ears ringing. "Nothing," the driver laughed. It was a high, manic laugh. "Not a scratch. They're throwing pebbles at us." Another hit. Clang. The tank rocked slightly. The shell had struck the turret front, 75mm of hardened steel. It had shattered harmlessly. The crew looked at each other. The fear in their eyes was replaced by a dangerous, intoxicating cocktail of adrenaline and invincibility. They were untouchable. The German shells were shattering like glass against their skin. "They can't hurt us," the loader grinned, wiping soot from his forehead. "We can sit here all day." The lieutenant looked back through the periscope. More flashes, more impacts. Bang, bang, whang. The noise was becoming a rhythm, a deafening industrial drumbeat. But the lieutenant didn't smile. He looked at the ammunition racks. They weren't full. He looked at the fuel gauge. He looked at the road stretching out behind them, empty. No infantry support, no artillery. The 37mm guns couldn't kill them, not yet, but they were knocking, and they had just told the entire German army exactly where they were. The lieutenant looked at the hatch above his head, a square of steel held shut by a latch. "We stay," the lieutenant said. The vibration of the next impact traveled up his boots, shaking his knees. "We block the road." He didn't say the rest. "We are already dead. We just haven't cooled down yet." The air in the turret was already turning blue with smoke. The ventilation fan hummed weakly, struggling to push the poison out. "Target the gun crew. High explosive. Fire." The war had shrunk to a box 2 meters by 3 meters, and the walls were closing in. The sun was a physical weight now. It beat down on the turret roof, turning the 45 tons of steel into a radiator. The lieutenant wiped his eyes. His glove came away slick with a mixture of sweat and oil. The door knockers, the little 37mm guns, had stopped about an hour ago. The silence that followed was worse. It was the silence of a predator taking a deep breath. "Water," croaked the loader. The lieutenant passed a canteen. It was warm, sloshing with a metallic taste. The loader took a sip, swished it around his mouth to clear the grit of cordite, and swallowed. Then the world turned upside down. There was no whistle. Direct fire doesn't whistle. Crack doom. The tank didn't just rock, it shuddered violently sideways, throwing the gunner off his seat. His head cracked against the breech guard. "Report!" the lieutenant screamed. He couldn't hear his own voice. The air pressure inside the turret spiked instantly, popping his eardrums. A thin trickle of blood ran from his left nostril. "They brought up the howitzers!" the driver yelled from the bow, his voice cracking. "105s, direct fire!" A second hit. Wham! This one hit the glacis plate. The shell didn't penetrate, the Voroshilov armor held, but the physics were inescapable. The kinetic energy of a 15-kilogram high-explosive shell moving at supersonic speed had to go somewhere. It went into the metal. "Spall!" the lieutenant roared, shielding his face. The inner wall of the turret, right next to the loader's head, exfoliated. It didn't break, but the shockwave flaked off razor-sharp shards of steel from the interior surface. A shotgun blast of metal splinters sprayed across the fighting compartment. The loader screamed, not a cinematic scream, but a wet, gargling gasp. He clutched his shoulder. Blood, dark and thick in the dim light, seeped through his tunic. "Masks! Put on your masks!" The ventilation fan was dead. The motor had burned out an hour ago. Now, with the 76mm gun firing and the enemy shells impacting, the air inside was a toxic soup. It was visible, a blue hanging haze of carbon monoxide and propellant gas. The lieutenant fumbled for his gas mask. His fingers were numb, vibrating uncontrollably from the concussions. He pulled the rubber mask over his face. The smell of charcoal and stale rubber filled his nose, replacing the stench of blood and cordite. But it was suffocating. The heat inside the mask rose instantly. Through the fogged lenses of his mask, he saw the crew. They looked like monsters, insects with long rubber snouts, huddled in the dark, twitching with every impact. Clang! Another hit. The interior light bulb shattered, plunging them into darkness. Now, only the thin shafts of sunlight cutting through the vision slits illuminated the smoke. The lieutenant felt a wave of nausea. It wasn't fear. It was the gas. The blue haze was doing its work. His limbs felt heavy, like he was moving underwater. He wanted to sleep. It would be so easy to just close his eyes and let the noise fade away. No. He slapped his own helmet. The sharp pain cleared his head for a second. He grabbed the periscope handles. He had to see. He twisted the optic toward the German lines. The field was a moonscape of craters. The wreckage of the trucks was still burning, sending black pillars into the sky. But the firing had stopped again. Why? He traversed the periscope left, then right. Movement, not tanks, not trucks, men. They were small gray shapes moving through the tall summer grass. They weren't running, they were crawling. They had no rifles in their hands. They were carrying large canvas bags and flat disc-shaped objects. Combat engineers, pioneers. The lieutenant's blood ran cold. Shells he could take, tanks he could fight, but men on foot, men who could climb onto the engine deck, men who could slide a satchel charge into the tracks or jam a grenade down the barrel. He keyed the laryngophone, but his throat was so dry the sound came out as a rasp. "Infantry," he choked out inside the rubber mask. "Close range, 50 meters. They're coming for the tracks." He looked at the machine gun ammo rack. It was half empty. "Wake up," he kicked the gunner's seat. "Coaxial, traverse left, cut them down." The gunner didn't move. He was staring at the wall, mesmerized by the glowing red impact mark where the last shell had hit. The steel was actually glowing from the heat of the impact. "They are climbing the hull," the driver whispered, his voice trembling. "I can hear them." The lieutenant ripped his mask off. He needed to breathe, even if the air was poison. He grabbed the turret traverse wheel himself. The metal was slippery with condensation. He spun it, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Outside, the first boot scraped against the metal skin of the tank. Night had fallen. The tank was no longer a fortress, it was a tomb. The temperature had dropped, but inside the steel hull, the heat remained, sticky and suffocating. The lieutenant held his Nagant revolver. His hand was shaking so violently that the barrel tapped against the turret ring. Tap, tap, tap. Above them, on the roof, something scraped. It was a slow, deliberate sound, like a rat scurrying inside a wall, but heavier. Metal on metal. "They are on the engine deck," the radio operator whispered. He was curled in a fetal position on the floor, hugging his knees. "Get them off. Please get them off." The lieutenant looked at the periscopes. Blackness. The vision blocks were useless at night. They were blind. "Swing the turret," the lieutenant hissed. "Knock 'em off." The gunner grabbed the manual traverse wheel. With the engine off to save the last drops of fuel, the hydraulic assist was dead. He had to crank the multi-ton turret by hand. He grunted, his back straining. The gears groaned, a long, rusted screech that echoed in the silent night. Screech! The scraping sound above stopped. The Germans had frozen. Then, a metallic clank. Right above the driver's hatch. "Satchel charge!" the driver screamed. He scrambled backward over the seats, kicking the loader in the face in his panic. "They're blowing the hatch!" "Brace!" The lieutenant didn't have time to think. He opened his mouth to equalize the pressure. Boom! The world turned white. The tank didn't rock this time. It jumped. The floor plates slammed up into their feet. Dust, rust, and loose bolts rained down from the ceiling. The concussion was like a physical punch to the solar plexus. For 10 seconds, there was only a high-pitched ringing. The lieutenant blinked. He was alive. The hatch hadn't given way. The Voroshilov armor was too thick. But then came the realization. He tried to move the tank. "Driver, start! Move us!" The driver dragged himself back to the seat. He hit the starter. The compressed air hissed. The V2 diesel engine coughed, spat, and roared to life. He slammed the gear lever forward. The transmission engaged with a clunk. The engine revved, but the tank didn't move. It pivoted. Only the right side moved. The tank spun in a grotesque circle, grinding the earth. "Track!" the driver yelled, his voice breaking. "Left track is gone. They blew the track." The lieutenant slumped against the breech guard. A mobility kill. They were no longer a vehicle. They were a pillbox, a stationary target sitting in the middle of a Lithuanian field. From outside, through the ringing in their ears, they heard a voice, a German voice shouting in the dark, surprisingly close to the vision slit. "Rus, komm heraus, bread, water, Russ!" It was a taunt, or an offer. It didn't matter. The lieutenant looked at his crew. They were ghosts, faces blackened by soot, eyes red-rimmed and wide with madness. They looked at him, waiting for the order to surrender. The hatch was right there. They could open it, they could breathe fresh air, they could drink water. The lieutenant raised his revolver. He didn't point it at the crew. He pointed it at the hatch. "We wait for morning," he said. Day 2. Thirst was a solid object in the lieutenant's throat. It felt like he had swallowed a handful of sand. His lips were cracked and bleeding. The sun was back, heating the armor again. The cycle of the oven began anew. "Movement," the gunner rasped. He didn't look away from the sight. He was fused to it now. The lieutenant dragged himself to the commander's cupola. His legs were numb. He looked out. Tanks. German tanks. Small ones. Panzer 35Ts. They were scurrying out of the forest, moving across the field in front of them. "They are flanking?" the lieutenant muttered. "Why are they showing their sides?" The German tanks were moving erratically, drawing fire. They were buzzing like flies, annoying, distracting. "Load AP," the lieutenant croaked. "Target the lead tank." The loader moved like a zombie. He picked up the armor-piercing round. It slipped from his sweaty, weak grip and clanged against the floor. He didn't curse. He just picked it up again, his movements slow, agonizing. Shh! Clack! Fire! The KV-1 rocked. The shell flew true, smashing into a Panzer. Smoke erupted, but the lieutenant felt a prickle on the back of his neck. It was too easy. They were bait. He spun the periscope to the rear. His heart stopped. While they had been watching the tanks in front, the Germans had moved something into position behind them. At the edge of the forest, 800 meters away, it looked spidery. Thin legs dug into the ground, a long, slender barrel pointing straight at them, an 80 mm flak gun, the 8-8, the only thing in the Wehrmacht's arsenal that could kill them. "Traverse rear!" the lieutenant screamed. "Rear! Flak gun!" The gunner tried to spin the wheel, but his arms were jelly. The heavy turret barely moved. It was crawling, inch by agonizing inch. Through the periscope, the lieutenant saw the German crew moving with terrifying precision. He saw the loader shove the massive shell into the breach. He saw the gunner crank the elevation. The barrel of the 88 stared directly into the lieutenant's soul. "Faster!" he begged. "Faster!" The KV-1's turret was halfway around. The gun was pointing at the sky, useless. He saw the muzzle flash. It was strange. You see the flash before you hear the sound. For a fraction of a second, the lieutenant thought, they missed. Then the universe collapsed. Crack. There was no ringing this time, just a sudden, violent overpressure. The shell didn't explode. It punched through the rear armor like a needle through skin. It passed through the engine block, punched through the firewall, and entered the fighting compartment. The sound was the sound of air being instantly compressed into a solid wall. The lieutenant was thrown against the turret roof. He felt something warm spray across his face. He didn't know whose blood it was. The tank was dead. The silence that followed was absolute. No engine, no breathing, just the hiss of hydraulic fluid spraying onto hot metal. Smoke began to fill the cabin, not the blue haze of gunpowder, but the thick black choking smoke of burning oil. The lieutenant tried to lift his arm. He couldn't feel his fingers. He looked down. A single shaft of sunlight pierced through the hole the 88 had made. It illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air. It was beautiful. He closed his eyes. General Erhard Raus stood before the beast. Up close, the KV-1 was monstrous. It loomed over the road like a prehistoric creature that had died, refusing to fall. The steel was scarred with hundreds of pockmarks, silver splashes where the 37mm shells had shattered. There were deep gouges from the 105s. The track lay unraveled on the dirt like a dead snake. And there, in the rear turret plate, was the single neat hole of the 88. Raus adjusted his monocle. He had seen many battles, but he had never seen this. 1 tank, 2 days. An entire battle group halted. "Open it," he ordered softly. 2 pioneers climbed onto the hull. They didn't cheer. They moved respectfully. They pried at the commander's hatch with a crowbar. It groaned, the metal fused by heat and impact, before finally popping open with a rush of foul air. The smell hit them first. The smell of roasted meat, oil, and death. The pioneer looked inside, then pulled back, taking off his cap. He looked down at the general and shook his head. "They are all there, Herr General." Raus nodded. He looked at the faces of his own men. They weren't smiling. They were staring at the tank with a mixture of horror and awe. Soldiers know when they are in the presence of something pure. "Get them out," Raus said, gently. They pulled the bodies out one by one. The lieutenant came last. He was small, his uniform stained black, his face peaceful in the rigor of death. "What do we do with them, sir?" a young lieutenant asked. "Leave them for the locals?" Raus looked at the Russian officer's body lying in the Lithuanian grass. "No," Raus said. "Dig a grave, here, next to their tank." "Sir?" "Full military honors," Raus snapped. "They fought like men. We will bury them like men." Later that afternoon, a strange ceremony took place. German soldiers, who had spent 48 hours trying to kill these men, stood in formation. A salute was fired. A simple wooden cross was placed over the fresh mound of earth. Raus looked at it one last time before climbing into his staff car. The tank remained. a silent sentinel at the crossroads. As the German column finally began to move again, rolling past the iron grave, the tank crews saluted, not for the hammer and sickle, but for the crew who had refused to open the door.